And the bag had a zipper. So I opened the zipper, unzipped the bag, looked inside. It's full of cash. And he says, run. So I zip it back and we start running. Like we were running for probably, 5 minutes at least.
Okay.
Like turning right, left. Just get the hell out of there.
Welcome to the Safety Doc Podcast with author, radio host, and nationally recognized safety expert, Dr. David Perrodin. Join us each week as we discuss the best and most bizarre practices in safety preparation and crisis response. Follow Dr. Perrodin on Twitter at SafetyPhD. And remember, the truth will keep you safe.
Whoa, Rick, check this guy out. He's got a lot going on for him. Silence, Morty.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. David Perrodin from down here in the North Star Recording Studio, where tomorrow it will be 100 degrees. So the hottest day of the year. It does warm up down here in the studio, but it will get nowhere near triple digits. So in today's podcast, a special guest coming to us from eastern side of the world. You know, we've got the time zones going on. Australia. Nikolai Razouvaev.
Correct.
Wow. All right. So Nikolai, he grew up in North Caucasus. Is that right?
Caucasus.
Okay, I'll do it. Nikolai grew up in North Caucasus, part of the former Soviet Union, where he was singled out as a future cycling champion and Olympic gold medalist. In 1984, he won gold at the Junior World Olympics. Nikolai pursued gold medals for 2 decades behind the Iron Curtain, but the real lure of the sport wasn't national glory. He wanted to avoid national service and access travel to the West and all the benefits that entailed. Nikolai has recently returned to road racing in Australia, where he also coaches other cyclists, and he works for a company that's involved with clinical trials for people experiencing depression or cognitive decline. So fascinating. He was a cyclist with the Soviet Union at the time of Chernobyl, and he was biking in Kiev, which is 62 miles or 100 kilometers from Chernobyl. So he's going to tell us about that. Just absolutely fascinating story. And when I initially approached him, I saw him on the Masculine Geek podcast, and I started to read his material. And I thought this show was going to talk, be centered about this awesome experience of driving or biking past buses that were lead covered in Kiev, right outside of Chernobyl. I thought that's where this discussion would go, but then I learned so much more. It was at the time of perestroika, so much opening up in the Soviet Union, so much information, the cascade of information. That's what we're going to talk about today. Rapidly processing cascade of information, trying to make sense of it all. So this is going to be a really good show. A few things, a shout out to the 405 Media in Los Angeles, California for airing the show 2 p.m. PST daily, the 405media.com. Check out my work at safetyphd.com. And in the back here, you can see it, and we'll put it up, but it is the book School of Airs back there, over there. You can check that out too. So today, Nikolai, first of all, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. I have no complaints. All good.
Great stuff. So you were biking. Now, first of all, I love to bike. So we have this connection. Also, you post on Twitter photos when you're out biking. So many stories of you out biking. But your biking, was it a day or 2 days after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which was April 26th, 1986? So let's go back to that time. Where were you? And tell me what was going on in your world.
Yeah, well, let me start with a bit of a correction, about the Olympic Games. I did not win the Olympic Games It was a world championship, junior world championship, and it's sort of normal for non-athletes to sort of confuse the two, but these are two different things. So not Olympic Games, world championship.
World championship.
I don't want to be accused of, grabbing titles that I did not win. Probably again, just to start that conversation about Chernobyl, I need to probably give you some background about why we were there in the first place. Now, my team that I used to race for was called Titan, or Titan in English, I guess. It was based in Kiev itself. So we were in and out of Kiev all the time because it's our base. Kiev is obviously capital of Ukraine. I was not originally from Ukraine. I was headhunted, I guess, for this team when I was. Oh, here's a map.
Yep.
Is Ukraine? Yeah, that's red spot. It's Kiev. But originally, I'm from, as I said, from North Caucasus. If you keep going southwest to the southeast, to the Black Sea, and going east and more east toward Georgia. No, the other way.
Right over here, huh?
Toward Turkey, yeah. So if you go a little bit, zoom in on this region called Caucasus. No, east. If you go east, yeah, a bit more east. So now you can see this whole region is called, where the green is, it's Caucasus. It's a massive mountains, much higher than the Alps.
Okay.
And if you keep going south, a bit south, you will see Georgia, and north of Georgia, you will see a city called Nalchik, just going 90 degrees up. Yep.
Right here. Yep.
I think this is it, Nalchik. Yeah. I can't see without my glasses. So that's where I'm originally from. So it's neighboring well-known places like Chechnya. So if you go a little bit more east, Grozny, maybe a couple of inches, yeah, you will see we are neighboring Chechnya. On the south is Georgia. If you keep going south, it's Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then Turkey. Further east is Caspian Sea, Iran, and all of those things. So that's very close to a hotspot, I guess, of geopolitics. But I was picked by this team from Kiev when I was 17, and therefore, for the rest of my cycling career, I was based in Kiev. Now, back to 86. In 86, Kiev was supposed to host the peace race. The peace race was what Tour de France is today for the professionals. So it was the biggest race. It was the most important race for amateurs, a stage race. But unlike Tour de France, peace race was also a political event. It was started right after the Second World War, and obviously the name implies a political angle to it. So a peace race was to celebrate the peace, the victory over Nazi Germany. And the race was traditionally from day one up until 1985 held between three countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. So they would rotate the starts. 1 year it would start in Berlin, then next year it would start in Prague, next year it would start in Warsaw. But in 85, to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the great victory over the Nazi Germany, they decided to start the race in Moscow. And again, if you think about it, if you start in Moscow and finish in Berlin, which was the idea,
sure,
it has a lot of other ideas behind it. We start in Moscow and we finish in Berlin. So that was the first time they introduced something new. It was for 30 plus years held in Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden they decided to start that race in Moscow. But in 86, I guess, to keep going with this novel idea, they decided to start the race in Kiev. And the peace race was traditionally started in May, early May, like 2nd of May, 3rd of May, whatever, 6th of May, something like that.
Okay.
So it was scheduled to start in Kiev in early May. And end of April, 26th of April, Chernobyl blows up.
Yeah.
And we arrived in Kiev a day or two after the accident happened. So we were racing in Uzbekistan at the time, and came to Kiev to race kind of a rehearsal. They, just like in Moscow, they had a rehearsal, and in Kiev they organized a race which would race all the stages in Kiev. So exactly the same format, exactly the same race, except the participants would be all from the Soviet Union. Okay. So that's why we were in Kiev in the first place. So we landed in Kiev, I don't remember, 27th or 28th, day or two after the Chernobyl. At the time of landing, like this is 2 days at least after the accident, we absolutely had no idea what happened.
That's and amazing.
Nobody in the country, except obviously the people who were supposed to know, they knew. But the rest of the country and people, I guess, who were near the Chernobyl, who I guess by this time, some of them or most of them have been already evacuated because this thing was just a disaster, a big disaster. We had absolutely no idea. So as we're driving from the airport, we had our team bus. As we're driving from the airport to the base, our driver starts talking about, hey guys, have you heard what happened in Chernobyl? And we were obviously, a lot of us were not even from Ukraine. So it's like an international team, quote unquote. So a lot of guys were from Russia. Some of them, of course, were from Ukraine. So we didn't know much of a geography. I mean, you know the major things, but the rest of it is like, what is Chernobyl? Nobody heard about it, even though it's very close to Kiev. So he goes, have you heard about the accident that happened in Chernobyl? And obviously we're going like, Chernobyl? Wow, what are you talking about? So he starts explaining to us that he heard a rumor that a nuclear station blew up in Chernobyl. We didn't even know there was a nuclear power station.
Yeah.
And as we're driving, he tells us this, and we go, oh, okay, whatever, it's, who cares? We have a race to do. And that's how I arrived in Kiev without even knowing what happened. And as you've mentioned, Kiev was only 100 kilometers away from Chernobyl. And this is the second or third day of the accident. So this thing is blowing up like there's no tomorrow.
Right.
Yet we have absolutely no idea. So everything from that point on went as normal. We were not officially told by anybody. The race was scheduled as usual, and it started a couple of days later, and we started racing. that's
so you're 20 years old at the time, right? You're 20 years old.
Yeah. I was 20 years old. I was a world champion at this time. Sort of one of the most promising cyclists in the peloton, young cyclists in the peloton. So I had a big future ahead of me. So that was how we arrived in Kiev.
And to put a context on to biking, right? If biking wouldn't have been the path, right? If you wouldn't have worked as hard, been as talented, gone into biking, you would have been in the military service. And at that time, the Soviet Union was actively fighting in Afghanistan. So there was a high probability you could have been fighting in Afghanistan, right? That was
one of the motivating factors of, I guess, my success was to avoid the service in the Soviet army. Now, obviously, it was compulsory for all males 18.
Right.
Once you turn 18, you have no choice but to go for 2 years in the army. Except at the time, the only way to escape it is to go and study at a university where they had military faculty, so you could do your service during your study. So it was not really an army, it was just theory and a bit of practice. But as you do university for 4 years, it was reckoned to you as service in the army. So that was the only escape. But when I was close to 18, they I think in 84, 85, they canceled this escape route because the war in Afghanistan was escalating and they needed soldiers, and they basically canceled this little loophole. So everybody had to go to serve in the army. And for me, like you kind of grow up, and as a kid, you don't really care. You will go in the army,
Right.
And while you're a kid, obviously you have this romantic ideas about the army and all of that. But as you become a bit older, 16, 17, you start hearing stories what the army is, and the Soviet army at the time was not much different to a prison. So you basically were preparing yourself to go to a prison.
Sure.
For nothing, like it's not even a punishment. There was a lot of bullying going on, a lot of abuse, a lot of nonsense going on. Obviously, you were suppressed by the military discipline and all of that. So it's not scared me, but I did not want to go. And so when I started cycling soon after, talking with my coach and discussing my future, I learned that if I do well, I can escape this route. Like if you are a high-level athlete, you can still go to the army on paper, but you can still keep racing.
Right.
So you will be enlisted, but you will not be touched. You can still race and continue your career. So I don't want to go into mechanics of it, but that was how the system was set up. Obviously, everyone understood if you go to the army for 2 years, your career is finished. So they allowed athletes to serve in the army without actually serving in the army. So that was a massive incentive for me to be serious about my cycling career. And this is what exactly happened. When I was 17, I was headhunted by Titan. They invited me to a team. It was a professional team. I was paid a salary, but also they had a system set up, very well-oiled system where you would not go to the army. You would still be enlisted, which is what happened to me. We went to a military base where we swore an allegiance to the Soviet Union as part of the process of enlisting into the army. And then after giving this sort of allegiance, we left. Usually you would stay for a couple of weeks, but we left. And that's how my service in the Soviet army started. So I actually served in the army for 2 years, but I kept racing. So that was a massive motivation for me and fueled, I guess, my career to avoid being in the army.
And also a massive pressure to not ask questions when you're in Kiev and the bus driver is saying, "Hey, did you hear about whatever?" It's kind of like, okay, but you're not going to be asking questions. You're not going to be doing anything to rock the boat in that situation because the stakes are way too high for you. This is completely what you're doing. Everything is cycling.
Thank you for tuning in to the Safety Doc Podcast with the nation's leading safety expert, Dr. David Perodin. Author, radio show host, university instructor, researcher, expert witness, and consultant. Powerful testimonials. Dr. Perodin has a strong reputation as the go-to safety consultant, and he was still able to exceed our expectations. When we went looking for an expert in the field of crisis preparedness and prevention, David was the single person we pursued. Not easy stepping into the touchier subjects of life, but Dr. David pulls it off. Take a listen. Now, back to Dr. David Perodin and the Safety Doc Podcast.
Tell me about when you first saw the buses. So there were countless buses brought to Kiev for evacuation. They're covered in lead. Kind of run me through that whole, when you saw them, what they physically looked like, what people were saying, and because wow.
Yeah, those buses, I think because I saw them during a training ride, just from, mind you, this is 86, so it's what, 34 years ago. Because we saw them on a training ride, I'm sort of concluding from that it was before the race started. So we went for a training ride. So it must have been first or second day after we have arrived in Kiev. And we went for a ride, and just outside of Kiev, as we're riding in a group, so it's 20 guys, and plus a team car behind. So as we're leaving Kiev, because our base was in the city itself, so you had to ride for about 10-15K through the city to get out of the city. So as we got out of the city, we see these buses lined up on both sides of the road, like probably for 2-3 kilometers non-stop, bus one after another, just parked on the side of the road, empty buses. And a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them were covered in lead. The windows were covered in lead. And after that, when we came back, we were obviously talking about it, and someone, I guess, mentioned that these buses are for the kids to be evacuated from Kiev. And this is when it hit me that this shit is real.
Right.
It's not a joke. If they are evacuating kids from Kiev, getting them out of the city, this is serious. This is not a joke. This is going to be, it's already a disaster, and they're trying to save the kids. Now, when you think about it, Kiev, it was at the time, I think, it's obviously a capital of Ukraine, or the capital of Ukraine, 2.5 million people.
Right.
100 kilometers away, like 60 miles away from Chernobyl. So if you put yourself in the shoes of the authorities, you would probably asking yourself a question, what do we do? We have a major city on our hands to deal with. We have maybe there's plenty of other smaller cities around. So it's not just Kiev in isolation. There are smaller cities, 200, 100,000 each, villages, townships. You're talking about, I don't know, 3.5-4 million people to care about. And then you think of what actually is happening in Chernobyl. This thing is on fire. It's blowing radiation. Like, if you compare it to a nuclear attack, like bombing, nuclear bomb, there's a huge difference in it, because the bomb explodes and obviously emits radiation, but the spread is because there is an explosion. And I guess, I'm not specialist in it, but I guess there is less radiation in the bomb than when you compare it to a nuclear reactor constantly emitting a massive amount of radiation 24 hours a day, non-stop for days and days. So for authorities, I think the question was, what do we do? Obviously, these guys have no idea who are in charge of all of this. So I'm guessing their advisors, people who understood what they're dealing with, probably have told them that anywhere near the reactor, it's deadly, it's lethal. You go there, you're dead, there, right there.
Yeah.
Unless you put some protective gear. But if you move away, let's say, I don't know, 500 meters away from the reactor, or a kilometer away, I don't know the numbers, but let's say you move away slightly, you're not going to be dead right away, but it's bad. It's you're going to get sick, and then you will die maybe 2 months later.
Right.
If you move away maybe 5 kilometers, you're not going to be dead right away, or even you might not even have any consequences. But if you stay only for 5-10 minutes, if you stay for 3-4 hours, you're going to get sick and you're going to die. And as you move further and further away, the danger, I guess, lessens. And that's where, I guess, this idea of a 30-kilometer zone came into place. They've decided that 30 kilometers is more or less safe. Outside of that zone, it's still bad. It's still going to affect you, but it's not lethal immediately. It's not deadly immediately. And when you look at Kiev, which was 60 miles away from the nuclear reactor, I guess the idea was, well, we have now 4 million people, 3.5 million people on our hands, especially Kiev. You cannot evacuate. Well, you can, but how are you going to do it? Like, where are you going to place all these people?
Right.
2.5 million people. You cannot stop the economy and all of those things. But 100K is kind of safe enough. And if we, I guess, implement some safety measures, we probably can avoid very bad sort of consequences. It's still going to be bad, but nobody's going to die tomorrow. Nobody's going to die in 3 months, and we will just hush and keep going. I guess that was the approach they took.
So the information you're getting, then you're sharing with me a previous discussion we had. There were 2 radio stations that you were able to listen to from Kyiv, and I believe they're out of Germany. But 2 radio stations where then you were hearing a different perspective on what was happening. So tell us about that.
Yeah, those radio stations. One was called Voice of America, and another was called Free Europe, I think. Radio Svoboda. It was called Radio Freedom, whatever you call it. Both of them obviously were financed and funded by the CIA. Everybody knows that by now.
Sure.
And they were designed to, obviously for propaganda purposes, but unlike Soviet radio, I think they have supplied plenty of, I would say, useful information, maybe not necessarily truthful all the time, but it was useful. So for me, I discovered those radio station as a key. Things in countries like Soviet Union, you have to understand, even though you're locked up and the information is controlled, you cannot control everything. It's impossible, especially in pre-internet days of books and radio stations and all of that. You cannot control that. Books were still smuggled in, and those 2 stations were jammed. There was a lot of sophisticated, I guess, equipment to jam them. But if you had a decent radio receiver, you can still hear, you can still listen to this broadcast. I mean, they were extremely hard to listen to because of the jamming, but it was possible. That's how we were listening also to some music from the West. Yeah, music was also smuggled in, plenty of music. When I was growing up, I had access to anything I liked, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Deep Purple, and whatnot, Pink Floyd, all of those things. My wife is smiling at me. I discovered those stations when I was a kid. Things like that word get around. People ask you, have you listened to this? Have you listened to that? And that's how you start tuning in. Obviously, it's a shortwave stations, shortwave broadcasts. So you would sit sometimes at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night and just browse, I guess, the radio waves trying to catch.
What was coming through? I mean, what were you hearing? What were people starting to hear about, the Chernobyl incident?
Well, they were saying that Chernobyl had a very, very serious nuclear accident, and Chernobyl is blowing up a lot of radiation into the air, so much so that scientists in Sweden have noticed the second day, I think second or first day after the accident, they were noticing unusual readings on their radiation, I guess, devices or whatever they call them. So they were telling us from those stations that Chernobyl has a huge problem. Yeah, so as you can see, couple of thousand kilometers away from Kiev. And on the second day after the accident, they knew about it more than us. And that was, at the time, for a while, that was the only source of information about what happened. And as always in Soviet Union, you have to sort of compile your picture of what's going on from different sources. So those radio stations were one source, rumors were the other source. Obviously, people who have been evacuated from Chernobyl and Pripyat. Pripyat was a small township, like a service city to Chernobyl, a nuclear station. They started obviously talking. They have seen death. They have seen people dying. They've seen, I guess, I think there was a helicopter that caught fire and fell somewhere near the station. So these things were spreading. And rumor in Soviet Union was one of the sources of truth. So you usually accept the rumors as truth. So we had this picture of like a few days into the accident, we knew that the shit had hit the fan in a big way.
And when you were biking, then so Kiev is starting to empty out, right? But when you're biking, they're actually washing the city streets down with big equipment, right? Every few hours, is that?
Yeah. Well, every few hours. They started obviously at some point. For example, when the peace race was supposed to start on, I don't remember the date. I think it was the 3rd of May, something like that.
Okay.
When the teams have arrived in Kiev, all the Western teams, France, I don't remember if United States was part of it. I mean, they were part of it from time to time. I don't think they were constant presence during the peace race, I guess because of political sort of differences. But the Western European nations always participated. So when they landed in Kiev, by this time, that probably is 10 days after the accident, everybody knew pretty much what was happening. And at this stage, the Soviet authorities, I guess, had no choice but to start talking about it in a limited way. So Western teams literally turned around, they've chartered the plane and left.
Right.
They didn't even bother participating. They didn't bother even leaving the airport. They were so scared, they just packed their bags. Didn't even pack the bags.
Right.
They just boarded the plane and left. And only the Eastern Bloc countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and all of those guys, they were ordered to stay in race. So, what was the question you asked?
So when you're racing, the streets are empty, right? And they're periodically washing. So what are you making? What's going through your mind and your teammates? I guess it's got to be like, God, this is significantly more serious than what they're telling us, or because you said you get many sources of information. You're getting the radio station, you're getting rumors, which you could trust, and now you're also you're observing things. You observe the buses lining up, and now you're going through the city, and you're like, whoa! And plus, you're like, the Americans aren't here, the French aren't here, and so on. Tell me about that experience when you're going through, the city's empty, the streets are being washed. What are you thinking? What are other people saying? What does that mean to you? Are you concerned about yourself? Even I know you're 20. When we're 20, it's like, whatever. But were there moments where you just kind of thought, wow, or I've got to get more information. I have to figure out more of what's going on. Here's 3 people I can talk to.
It's, this kind of accidents, I guess, maybe you understand now much more about that, but at the time, you see, it doesn't hurt you, right? It doesn't make you bleed. It doesn't kill you. And you kind of think that, well, nothing is really happening, right? It's invisible. Nothing is really happening. I'm fine. What happens in the future, I don't really know. And probably it's not going to affect me that much. So that's kind of the mindset and interpretation of the events you have at the time, even though everything around you tells you otherwise.
Right.
Even the authorities at some point have basically unofficially said, if you can get out of Kyiv, get out of Kyiv. So a lot of people left. I don't know how many. Obviously, thousands of people have left. My future wife, for example, left to Moldova, to her friend's place. They just packed and left because, see, people on one hand, they were realizing it's dangerous, it's bad, it's going to affect your health. On the other hand, people like myself, we were, well, as I said, it doesn't hurt, it's invisible, and we have a race to race, and I have a career to keep racing. So I don't really, not that I don't really care, but do I have a choice? No, I don't.
Right.
So I stay where I am. As I said, even though information I could observe was suggesting that this is going to be really bad. So as I said, they were started washing the streets, which obviously washes away some of the radiation that is on the streets. So if you wash it, you at least reduce.
Right.
I don't know how exactly it works. The particles or whatever, they get washed away and then they get dumped into a river or whatever. But they started washing not every hour, not every few hours, but constantly. Like they would wash streets in Kyiv, and then they would come back, I guess, the next day and keep washing. And when the peace race started, I remember watching it from home, from the apartment I was sort of in. They were broadcasting the entire race, and I remember the streets were completely empty. Like there was no one on the streets. I think a lot of people realize that it's better to keep inside. It's kind of similar to what's going on now, although we are forced to stay inside. But I guess a lot of people back then, at the time, realized it's a better idea to be outside. So they were either working, or if they were at home, they were staying at home. So the streets, I remember being completely empty, not 100% empty, but pretty empty. And the race there was no spectators, there was nothing. I mean, I didn't race the actual peace race. I didn't qualify, but I was watching it from the apartment on television, and it was bizarre. Small peloton, because half of the peloton had left, so it was only small. But also, speaking of rumors, one of the rumors was that to safeguard yourself from the radiation, you have to drink a lot of red wine.
Okay.
So people, I mean, this is Soviet Union, right? Even though it's not Russia, it's Ukraine.
Sure.
But it's the same culture. People like a drink, so they would not even have to be prompted to drink more. So you would imagine there was a lot of drinking going on, and in addition to red wine, vodka would be also used. I mean, people, I remember saying, it's alcohol, it doesn't matter if it's red or white, we might as well just drink vodka.
Yeah. So
a lot of drinking was going on. It was a weird time. Some people, as myself, basically resigned, like, I can't do anything about it. I'm here to stay for the next several weeks at least, for training camp and whatnot. I can't go anywhere, so I'm stuck. There's nothing to worry about. Like, I can't do anything about it, so I just stay.
Wow.
A must-read for parents, teachers, and taxpayers. Dr. David Perodin has written the most honest book about the $3 billion school safety industrial complex. Attorney James Sibley proclaims, a brave demonstration of speaking truth to power. School of Errors rips the lid off the billion-dollar school safety industry. Using real-world examples of successful responses in desperate situations, David contrasts the expensive window dressings pitched to panic parents with the inexpensive and effective approaches proven to actually work. Read this book before you let your school waste another precious dollar on meaningless safety theater. Buy the international bestseller, School of Errors, Rethinking School Safety in America, now at Barnes & Noble or Amazon.
So, I thought this was the whole story, and then we were talking more, and you talked, made me aware that Chernobyl happened, but it was also in this bigger context of perestroika. So that was the political movement for reformation within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union during the 1980s. It was widely associated with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and the glasnost policy reform. So part of that you're sharing was, so again, concurrent with Chernobyl, suddenly there were independent newspapers that were being produced. And I want you to tell me that story, because prior to that, it was state newspapers, and suddenly these private newspapers, which are very expensive, but you have high trust in the information. So tell me, the information that you're getting from these private newspapers, how they formed, what you were learning, how you're trying to process that, things maybe you were learning about the Soviet Union that were different than what you grew up, what you were taught, your first 20 years, because this is fascinating by itself. That to understand that was happening. So, give us that context.
Yeah. To give you a bit of a background, by the mid 80s, when Gorbachev started his reforms, we have reached a point, at least I guess I'm primarily talking about my generation. So people at the time are 20, 25, maybe up to 30 years old. Slightly older, like my parents, I will leave them, that generation, I'll leave them alone for now. But we have reached a point where we stopped paying any attention. Well, like we didn't read newspapers. Let's start with that.
These are state newspapers, right?
Yeah, state newspapers. They were only, from memory, Trud, Izvestia, Pravda, Komsomolsk, maybe 5-6 major newspapers coming out of Moscow. Obviously, they were published in other cities, but production and content was produced in Moscow. And then you have your local ones, which nobody paid any attention to.
Sure.
So by this time, in mid-80s, nobody is paying any attention to newspapers. Nobody is paying any attention to state television. Again, 2-3 stations controlled by the state. The only reason you would watch television is to watch a movie. Nobody paid any attention to the news. So we reached a point where the propaganda became so annoying, and we became so immune that we stopped paying any attention to it. It was completely irrelevant. We didn't read it. We didn't listen to it. It was all non-relevant. And then Gorbachev comes along and starts his reforms. And he started with this idea of glasnost, which means, I guess, openness. And not so much openness, but I guess open access to information. So glasnost means we're going to talk about things openly without restrictions. Loosely translated, this sort of concept of glasnost. So all of a sudden, first of all, he allowed private enterprise, which was a criminal offense. You could not have a private enterprise in Soviet Union. If you tried to, you would be arrested and jailed. So if you try to, which is the fundamental concept of capitalism, buy low, sell high. If you try that in Soviet Union, if you buy something for 5 rubles and try to sell for 10 rubles, and they find out, that will be a criminal offense called speculation. You would be jailed.
Wow.
So one of the things that Gorbachev did, he allowed private enterprise. They were called cooperatives at first. but it was literally, in essence, private enterprise, a store. You could open a store and sell goods. But they also allowed publication of newspapers, pretty much newspapers, because nobody could publish independently a book because the publishing houses were still under government control. But somehow they found a way to publish newspapers, private newspapers. And that brought, I think that what actually made the whole reform possible is because people all of a sudden realized that they have been living in a castle of lies, so to speak. They did not know, they did not know the past. We were lied about our past. Our past was obviously glorified. We have achieved an enormous success in building the best society on earth, almost like an utopia, even though like it's one of those paradoxes you see around yourself, and it's not a paradise at all. It's a decent way of living. Nobody is hungry, nobody is suffering, but it's obviously not what you would describe as utopia. So when this is all started, that gave us access to information that was not available before. So we started learning about repressions during the Stalin era. We started learning about unprecedented corruption in the government and things like that. So during that Chernobyl time, those newspapers were also the source of information that were informing us about what was happening. And those newspapers, as you said, they were very expensive, probably 20 times more expensive than a state newspaper. Mind you, the state newspaper was so cheap.
Right.
It was just pretty much a nominal price for a newspaper. 2 kopecks, I think, it cost. It's like nothing. The price of a matchbox. But those independent ones were costing a ruble or 2 rubles. This was expensive, very expensive. So what people did, they would buy one and they would just pass it around.
Sure.
So there were small edition newspapers because people could not, and not everybody could afford them, but they could pass them around. And that was one of the features of the Soviet Union, going back to the samizdat era. You know what samizdat is?
I don't know.
Samizdat is a typically Soviet invention. Samizdat literally means self-published.
Okay.
So when the books were banned in Soviet Union, people used to type banned books by hand and then distribute those, not manuscripts, but those books typed on A4 paper among themselves. And that also was a criminal offense. So if you that's how I, for example, discovered books by Solzhenitsyn. So one of my friends passed me a book, and that's how I read for the first time in my life.
Amazing, yeah.
That's something that blew my mind away, but those newspapers were kind of samizdat, they were now legally permissible, but we would pass them around as those books that we used to pass around before. So that independent publishing, I guess, fueled the reforms because people understood that we were living in a bizarre world of lies and kind of pretty much jail. Like you were locked up, you were not allowed to leave the country, you were lied to for 50 years or so, and all of a sudden you have this material available to you telling you that what they told you all your life was a lie. And of course that made people want to change the system. So that's why he had so much, I guess, support among the population to change. But the change went way too far. I don't think they planned for the destruction or the collapse of the Soviet Union. But that information, which is, going back to this idea of what information is and how powerful and important information is. that information destroyed the Soviet Union because everyone realized that far out we were living in this strange world of lies, and we need to change. We need to change that, but didn't end up changing much.
When we talked, you're telling me it was like, you know, growing up and the only rainbow you knew was always black and white. It was, and suddenly you see the colors of the rainbow. Once these newspapers, you have access to these newspapers. And I'm assuming these newspapers, everybody is seeking them purely for the content. I mean, these aren't like newspapers that we would think of, you know, today where there's a few articles and the rest is all advertisements and things like that. This is, people are thirsty for this content. So, you know, how do you get these newspapers? I mean, I'm trying to figure out, you said they were shared and they were passed around, but people probably didn't have a lot of money to print these. Who was writing these? Did you have anyone that you particularly went to? And then on top of that, maybe how did it change your thinking? You know, you're 20 or 20s, maybe, you know, your parents, older people, how did they start to process things when it's like, boy, you know, half my life or the majority of my life, I believe this. And now, you know, I have this information. Did people just ignore it? Did people just say, oh, okay, I'm 60 years old. I'm just going to, you know, pretend this doesn't exist and just play out the hand. This is wild from a sociological perspective of how people process information and how it changed their lives. Tell me what you saw.
People of older generation, I think it was a lot harder for them to accept the fact that they believed a lie all their lives. For us, it was a lot easier because we did not believe the idea. Like my generation, at least I guess people who had, I don't want to distinguish or to make people into smart ones and stupid ones. I don't believe that is actually an accurate description of general people. I think people generally intelligent enough to understand pretty much anything. It just comes down to laziness. Some people are lazy to use their intellect to discover things, to figure out things, to read. Also, they are poisoned. Their minds are poisoned by all kinds of entertainment and all kinds of nonsense. But they are intelligent people. Obviously, there are some stupid ones, but there are probably a small number. So for older people, it was not a matter of stupidity or not. It was a matter of rejection. As you probably know, there's a lot of studies around psychology, how people... I just read a couple of days ago, literally, a nice study about it, how people reject a contradiction to their prior belief. So it was very hard for them to accept, even though some of them knew something about, for example, Stalinism, like my father, for example, who was born in 1931. So during Stalin's era, he was a young man. And then obviously by the time Stalin died, he was 22. He knew something about it. He obviously witnessed and probably heard a lot of things that was going on during Stalin's era. So his view of Stalin was, he was obviously a hard man, but that what he did was necessary to, first of all, win the war. So he was surrounded by enemies. He was surrounded by capitalists, wanting to destroy the Soviet Union. So some of the things that Stalin did were necessary. He was a hard man, and most of all, and the most important thing, he won the war. So when you're looking at, you're trying to understand, when people trying, like, that's what sometimes bothers me so much about Western journalists writing about Russia. They completely miss a very important point about Russia, the importance of the war, of Second World War, in Russian psyche. Recently, like during this 75th anniversary of the victory of Nazi Germany, I think the White House, obviously from Trump's, it was probably his idea. They didn't even mention the Soviet Union as victors in the war, which was completely bizarre, like
Right.
very, very strange. So they celebrated the victory of United States, England, United Kingdom, France, but did not even mention the Soviet Union.
Wow.
Which I know, I understand that, but what I'm saying is that if people who write and talk about Soviet Union or Russia now don't understand the importance of that event in the psyche of the Russian culture, they just completely miss the point. It's extremely important for everyone who is from there to keep this in mind, that this is a massive event that is part of our, I guess, psyche. We've lost an enormous amount of people in that war.
Right.
It was a brutal war, and not so much. I'm not so much talking about the fighting and all those things, but the suffering of the civilian population. What the Nazis did to us, that's what sits in our psyche and continues to shape, I guess, our understanding of the outside world, so to speak. So for these people, for people like my dad and my mom, it was very hard to reject that past. So even though information was coming in, showing that what they lived through was based on a lie, well, they had difficulty accepting that. So they were trying to justify all those things that happened by the necessity and by the idea.
Right.
And now my generation, people who were born in the 60s, I was born in 1966, so people born in the 60s and I guess 70s, I don't think 80s matters from that point of view. But for us, we did not believe in the idea anymore. It was complete nonsense. So that's why I said we did not read the newspapers. We ignored propaganda. It was bouncing off our mind. I mean, obviously it had an effect on us.
Right.
Obviously we believed certain things about the West and all of that. We believed, for example, that the war with the United States is coming. It's unavoidable. So, and that also, I guess, in a sense, shaped our perspective on life, is that sooner or later it's going to be war, and this time it's going to be a nuclear war, so we might not even be around anymore.
Right.
But when these things started to happen, the Reformation in the Soviet Union, we really embraced and accepted on faith pretty much everything that was coming from this alternative, I guess, independent press, from the newspapers. Mind you, they were also polluted with all kinds of nonsense to do with what I would describe as yellow press. So it was a mixture of articles about Stalinism mixed with black magic, stuff like that, astrology, things like that.
Sure.
But we embraced this, and when the reforms started to be broadcast on television, so nobody ever watched what was going on inside the party. They were broadcasting communist forums and whatnot on television. Nobody would watch it, but all of a sudden, debates in the Russian or Soviet at the time parliament were broadcast live on television, and the entire country was watching it. Wow. Debates in the parliament. It was unheard of, we really embraced it, and we really believed a lot of things that were written, and it changed it changed a lot of what we saw and what we understood.
So, how about verifying information? You talked about, yellow journalism. How about, checking that there wasn't propaganda, government infiltration in the information you're getting, the newspapers? You said there was a high level of trust, but was there any other type of vetting that you did with that information?
No.
Okay.
No, you could only lots of these articles in newspapers was citing archives, right? So you would immediately assume that they're not lying. So and a lot of these people were historians and scientists, social scientists,
Okay.
who all of a sudden were allowed to speak the truth. So I'm assuming a lot of them knew, like people who were working with archives probably knew quite a lot, but they were not so much, obviously they weren't allowed to talk, but for them, opening their mouth and speaking the truth was suicidal. So they were not even in a position to discuss those things. So, and also you need to keep in mind that psychologically, when information is coming that completely contradicts the previous information, you kind of accept it by default. And it was written in a nice format. It was written in a narrative form as a story, so you have no problem accepting it. And then you also ask yourself a question: well, what's the alternative? Like, if what they're talking about, what's other possibility of we know the official story, and that now they're telling us something else. So you by default accept the something else because the previous one, the official one, is a lie. So
did you get together with friends or family or other people and talk through this? And
that was for the next couple of years, up until, I guess, well, the real reform started, I guess, in about 88, 89. In 89, I remember watching those debates in the parliament live between training sessions. So we would ride in the morning. A big ride would be 4 or 5 hours, and then you come and have a few hours of rest, and then you go for another ride at night. So we had 3 rides a day. So between those sessions, you would watch live broadcasts of debates in the parliament, and that's where you would see Yeltsin, giving hard time to everyone. Sakharov was well-known dissident that spent time in jail, not in jail as such, but in labor camps. He was a nuclear scientist, by the way. I think he was a Nobel laureate as well. I'm not sure about that, but he was a very well-known scientist in the Soviet Union. Now he became, all of a sudden, he was elected as member of parliament, and he was giving speeches. So you're watching all this stuff, and you literally do not believe what you hear, because you mind you, if you imagine you grew up in a system completely controlled by the state, you know that nobody is telling their mind, speaking their mind.
Right.
All of a sudden, they're discussing things that were unheard of before. It's hard to describe actually the effect of what was going on. You're like sitting watching this and going, "Holy shit!
Yeah,
this is this is really happening. They're changing the country." So that was mind blowing at the time.
Do you see any similarities between what's happening right now, for example, in the United States, and what you lived through in the 80s in Russia from a political standpoint? In the United States, question, should we play the national anthem before sporting events, which just had been typical, and now A lot of professional teams and college teams, whatever, are choosing not to do that because they feel it's not inclusive. It brings oppressive tones from the lyrics, and additionally, of course, you're aware of what's happening, but are there parallels? And if there are parallels, where do you think things will be at in the next 12 months, 2 years?
Yeah, there are parallels. I'll probably go a little bit back and explain my perception of what the West was. And then as I left the Soviet Union, I discovered completely different reality. So my perception of the West when I was in Soviet Union, it was backed up by my travel to the Western countries when I was part of the Soviet national team. We thought, even though we were told otherwise, we thought of the West as this kind of paradise. Not exactly, not literally, but a place of plenty, a place of universal prosperity. I mean, how you actually form this view is by believing that everyone has a car. In Soviet Union, almost no one had a car.
Right.
It was impossible to have a car, private car. I mean, some people did have, but the only way to have a car is you would only 90% of people who had cars engaged in some kind of illegal activity to earn this kind of money because the prices were insane.
Sure.
So you form this picture of the West as a place of plenty, a place of prosperity. Everyone has a car. Everyone lives in luxurious houses or apartments. Plenty of food. I mean, we had food, but it was limited in choice. So, and especially as you travel to the West, you see an amazing abundance of everything.
Right.
And it blows you. Like the first time I went to West Germany, it blew my mind. I walked into a shop and my jaw literally dropped. Like, how can people even live like that? It's impossible for me to imagine the abundance, how clean the roads are, how polite everyone is. Russia is a rough country. So when everyone is, like in Germany, saying, Danke schön, thank you. So you have this idea of the West being this very prosperous society where everyone is pretty much rich. Even though as I said, Soviet Union official version of it is that only a small portion of the people are rich. Everyone is pretty much poor, and there is a lot of unemployment, people living on the streets, and they will show you pictures and videos and on official broadcasts and all of that. So that was my and pretty much everyone else's understanding of what the West was, prosperity all through.
Right.
Then I leave the country, right? So I left in 91, and I spent a few months in Poland at first, and then I moved to Denmark, lived there for a couple of years, and then from Denmark I ended up in Canada, and then eventually traveled and settled in Australia. And by now, like a few years in, I understood that the West is not what I thought it was. It's still prosperous. It's still land of plenty.
Right.
It's a land of opportunity. You could be anything you want, but it's not a paradise. And as I continued living in the West, I started noticing more and more similarities with the Soviet Union. I think the first thing I've noticed was the bureaucracy, which was actually much worse than in Soviet Union. In Soviet Union, it was bad, but you could get around it by bribing people. It was pretty normal. If you need things done, you just go and openly pay someone, and things get done immediately. It was very easy. While in the West, bureaucracy was just as bad, but you could not bribe anyone, or at least not openly, or at least you couldn't know how to do it. and it was dangerous. If you offer someone a bribe, you might end up in trouble. But then more and more, especially in the last, I don't know, probably 10 years, it's not just those things, the bureaucracy, the inefficacy of institutions. Obviously, you're noticing that the government is not that much different in their goals and their approach to people. There are two classes, there are us and there are them. The us, are the people at the top live like kings, just like in Soviet Union, and people who are not at the top, they're not poor or anything, but the difference is immense.
Right.
But as the time went by, and I started paying attention, reading, I started noticing other things like propaganda. In fact, so much similar that it actually really, really interesting how the methods and approaches the Soviet Union developed over the years are now implemented in the West. And now, with the help of digital economy and digital tools and internet, the propaganda methods are much, much more effective.
So tell me about that. What's similar? Give me a couple examples.
It would take us another 2 hours to just discuss
one example of some propaganda that you saw in the West that patterns similar.
Probably. Well, there's quite a few like major ones. One is glorification of the ruling class or the government.
Okay.
The government is God, and we seek help from the government all the time. Government needs to do this. Government needs to do that.
Right.
So somehow people, if you compare it to 100 years ago, people were not relying so much on the government. They were much more independent and much more responsible for what they do.
Right.
While somehow something happened at some point, and I guess that was a slow process. People are now relying on the government. Government is supposed to solve all our problems.
Gotcha.
It was exactly like that in Soviet Union. People were not independently thinking, like generally speaking. There were obviously people who were, and I guess maybe I was one of them. But generally speaking, it's all about the government. The government needs to fix this. The government needs to fix that. Well, what about you? Why don't you fix it yourself? Then there is a glorification of war. It's exactly the same as in the Soviet Union.
Okay.
Soviet Union was, as I've mentioned this before, and the place that the war had taken in our minds as the Soviet, I guess, citizens. Reluctant to describe myself as a Russian because it becomes a little bit offensive nowadays. But mind you, the Soviet Union had many nationalities within its borders. It's not just Russians and Ukrainians, there were a lot more. So the glorification of war, there's obviously a place for a war. And you have to keep in mind my views. I'm really...
Right.
Anyway, we're not going there, but there is a place for war in self-defense to start with. You obviously are justified to defend yourself as an individual, as well as a society, as a group of individuals, as a unit of society. But what's happening is that the wars and the aggression is glorified. This is where what you've said about the national anthems is coming in. Obviously, I have my own opinion about this I guess, phenomena in the first place, by why we're singing the anthem in the first place. I'm not going there,
Right.
but the way it is spun by the media is what exactly was happening in the Soviet Union, so that you are told by the media what to think. And because the media is so pervasive, people begin to think what they're told.
Right.
That's one of the parallels of between what's happening in, for example, in the United States and the Soviet Union. And there are many more
Sure.
we can talk about. But it basically comes down to, I guess, the major ones are the propaganda, the brainwashing, and the acceptance by people of these ideas. You said what I'm thinking is going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
I think it's going to get worse before it will get better, because if there are any parallels with the Soviet Union, eventually people will come to realize that they're being lied to, that they cannot live like that any longer. But you're far away from it. You have to, I guess, live through the lies first before you realize. So you're far away. But you have already started this process, I believe, and probably you're past of the point of return. It's been underway for quite a while,
Right.
and it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. I mean, I'm hoping it's not going to turn into a bloody war. I'm hoping, but who knows? You have everything in place. People, which is a good thing. People are armed, which is a good thing. It's a very good thing that you in America are armed. Men are armed. A lot of men are armed, and women as well. So this can actually prevent a conflict.
You work in clinical trials with people with depression, Alzheimer's, cognitive decline. You shared with me that more people are coming in and wanting to participate in clinical trials for depression. So tell me what you make of that. What are people saying? Why do they want to participate in these studies? Is there a reflection on what's happening in society? Are more people more depressed? Are they perceiving, that this is a really, I guess, darker time for society? I think there are some real nuanced observations with that. What's your take on why that's happening?
I work, with a private company that does clinical trials for depression and Alzheimer's disease. But I don't work directly with patients. I work in marketing, so I'm in digital marketing. So I work in advertising, content production, and things like that. So I don't deal with patients directly. I'm not even allowed to.
Sure.
So all I do is advertising. But to give you, I guess, without revealing too much business information, we've seen an enormous jump in inquiries since the pandemic started. Although I must say that it's when I started with this company as well. So I started in March. So it could have been it could have been as a result. It obviously is a result of my marketing efforts, because the company did not engage as much in marketing of what they do.
Right.
Now do, but the amount of inquiries, compared to what it was before, is enormous. So what I'm I guess can conclude from that is, when people see us marketing what we do, they eagerly respond. And part of my job, because I receive the actual inquiries.
Right.
I can conclude that people are going through a tough period of time, and this is actually public information. I mean, it's not a secret.
Right.
That
Are they finding it? I mean, from your side, and I know, there's obviously proprietary information, but you can see from your interface people that are conducting searches on the internet for these terms and click through and things like that. You can objectively look at
yeah.
wow.
Obviously, being in digital advertising, I can see exactly what people are searching for. So I work with Google,
Okay.
and Facebook. So these are our two primary, or at the moment, the only two platforms that we use. We're going to use more, but obviously, Facebook has nothing to do with search. Facebook advertising is different to Google, but in Google you can see what people are searching for, and you can see that what searches are on the rise and what searches are on the decline. So that's public information, and people are searching for help for depression, and we will see pretty soon, I guess, information about suicides and things like. It's probably too early. They keep gathering information, but we will see the results, I guess, by the end of the year and things like that. And you also, in our previous talk, mentioned those 90 days sort of. It's not a scientific fact. Then again, what is scientific fact anyway? But we were kind of in that period of time, 100 to 90 days, when people just about to tell themselves we've had enough. So one would react with alcohol or drugs. Someone else might attempt to kill themselves. It's one of the reactions people have to this kind of events, unfortunately.
So what you're talking about, and just so I can bring this to the listeners, is Dr. Apple in the United States, Rommel in Germany during World War II, led studies at that time of soldiers, a concept called finite voltage. And basically, how long could soldiers be functioning on the front lines before they would either be killed, they would be taken prisoner, or they would have a mental collapse. So that was military. And then there were additional civilian studies that took place on civilian morale, military-led, mostly in World War II, although some of these studies took place in the early 90s from the U.S. government. And I'm sure there's more out there, but I was able to take multiple studies and talk with different experts and kind of find a theme that for civilians during a time of crisis, and again, a lot of it gets benchmarked to war, because what we've had right now with a prolonged pandemic coupled to civil unrest, this compounding comorbid time of chaos is pretty unprecedented. But anyway, 90 days. After 90 days, civilians tend to languish. They start to exhibit depression. They start to give up as a pattern. So what do? From a propaganda standpoint, is you make sure that before you hit that, you do initiatives. So we're going to do a scrap metal drive, for example, to give people purpose. We're going to do a plant your garden campaign. We're going to say we're now in phase 4 of the military campaign. So people believe there's been a shift. There's been some advance in the military campaign, even though there hasn't authentically been this advance. There's this image in people's minds. Okay, we're one step closer to having this done. So this 90 to 100 days, and it's interesting because right now I'm working with some people who are mapping out what has happened for the first 80, 90, 100 days of the coronavirus pandemic. What are propaganda things that have been done? And then also, are they observing people starting to, I guess, languish, starting to have mental collapse? So it's fascinating, right? Because there really isn't this intense body of research, but we do know that generally it was accepted, about 90 days, you had to change things up for civilians. So what you indicated, Nikolai, is, so these searches, right? Maybe right now, people are searching, help with depression, things like that. That could evolve to suicide prevention, things like that, or just thoughts of suicide, that could become a prevalent web search in another 2-3 months, especially as we get into colder climate weather here. So sometime, we don't have to talk about it now, but sometime if you could share with me how you look at the different searches that's public information, I'd be interested to look at that, because I'm guessing the first week of the coronavirus shutdowns here in the US, for example, people were searching how online if they could get certain foods, toilet paper, necessities, things like that, scarcity thinking. And then another thing that I saw happening right away, like the first week, and I had a member checks. A number of people all around the country were observing the same thing. It's called Craigslist. I don't know if they have it in Australia, but it's basically this online. It's almost an eBay type community, but it's local. So you just put stuff on and say, "Hey, I've got this, this really cool timer right here, and anybody, if you give me $5 for it, I'll drive it to your house. Okay, this will be yours." So suddenly, these Craigslist ads were just flooding. Literally, like 60,000 ads going up a day. Like in my area, people selling anything, firewood. I'll bring it to your house, for like $50, which is like half of what it usually would be. But so what was happening, and a ton of electronics, right? Phones, TVs, and or best offer. This is happening all over the United States. People need money because they don't have money to buy food. They are getting laid off their jobs. They're trying to get stuff while it's still on the shelves. And then, like 2 weeks in, the Craigslist stuff kind of stopped. It just went back to normal. And that indicated, so people go to a different phase But what you're talking about, is that when people are searching for depression, to me, that indicates we're out of the scarcity phase and we are into what's called like a crowd-in theory. And crowd-in is where people believe they're going to be home for a long time. That things aren't going to change for a long time, probably months. That's. And I've seen other sets of data come in that can kind of confirm that crowd-in theory. For example, in retail right now, interior paint is selling, puzzles are selling record sales, right? Which indicates that this is more of a crowd-in mentality. People believe they're going to be in their homes more. So they're going to buy things that are going to bring them comfort. Even if they don't have enough money for food, for example, it's this weird thing. But wow, so that's amazing. Anything that really stood out on you that you were starting to see from the analytics that was like a big warning or or just something you're like, I can't believe this. I can't. Any moment like that?
Not really, because the specifics of what I do is so narrow. So we pretty much focused on depression and dementia-related disease. So I haven't seen well, obviously there is a rise in inquiries and a rise in search for depression, but nothing that would. Thing is that it kind of makes sense, right? So
right.
You don't even think, oh wow, look at what's going on. So it kind of makes sense. It especially if you consider other information that is coming out, people having depression and drinking too much and whatnot. So it's not really, nothing really jumps at you. It's kind of normal, even though any other day it would have been, oh, look, something is going on here. But now it's right. Like, okay, yeah, it makes sense.
Right. Wow. So, and you don't, because you're newer with the company, you can't look back at, what it was 1 year ago this time, what it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, what the searches were. Do you have that ability?
Yeah, I can, but it would not make any difference for me as to what I do. I don't need to look at what was this year. Maybe at some point I would have to. I don't know. It's just sure. It's just the way we do business. At the moment, we don't need that data from a year ago. I could look at it, but it's not on my.
I'm just curious. because maybe it's like, you look back 1, 2, 3 years and you're like, yeah, right now the searches are 10 times what they were over last year or the year before. So it's not a seasonal thing. It's not like it's not, we get to March and April and it typically goes here. It's like, now it's like way, way up here. We've never, in looking at maybe a few years of data, this is just not something that's cyclical, right? It's so far off of something that's cyclical. Anything else? I have one question before we close here, but anything else you want to touch upon?
Well, there's we touched on a few things that are really interesting for me. We've touched on the changes that are happening in the United States. This one is a big one for many reasons. Obviously, the United States is the country that everything dances around it, and it's a very important player in the global arena. So what's happening there is important for many different reasons. So that is a big topic. We didn't really, I guess, explore that much. So maybe for another day, I don't know. But you've asked me, in your email with questions. You said you asked me if I know any crazy stories. You want to?
So yeah, so tell me some of these amazing biking stories. I want to hear them.
Well, it's not like the biking stories, but when you said in the email, do you have anything crazy you want to share?
It's crazy, crazy.
At first, I thought, I don't know. There's not. When you look back, mind you, it's quite a while ago. You kind of everything is kind of flat in your memory. Like it's a one big blob of your life. But then I was thinking, I actually remembered a couple. One is kind of important because the way it pretty much started the end of my career in the Soviet Union, like as a cyclist.
Okay.
I had this sort of incident where a huge amount of money fell in front of my feet, literally. And what happened was that during a race, there was a rest day. So stage races usually have a rest day in the middle of a stage race. So we were racing in Sochi, a city that hosted Olympic Games a couple of years ago in Russia, Winter Olympic Games. And myself and my friend went for ice cream. It was very warm. It's early spring. We went for ice cream, and as we had ice cream, we're going back to our hotel. And there is this pedestrian crossing, right, to cross on the other side of the road.
Sure.
And a car stops in front of us, like literally where we were standing. The car stopped on a red light and blocking us from crossing the road. And I'm like, okay, whatever, so just wait for this car to get out of here. And I see that a guy sitting in the back seat has his hand, like outside of a car window,
Yep,
holding to the roof. But in his hand is a handbag, like a small, not a
Okay.
small bag, but this bag.
sure.
So he's holding a bag and at the same time is holding to the roof with his bag in his hand. And then they're waiting for a red light to turn green. And then he takes his hand inside the car and the bag stays on the roof. So he completely forgets about the bag.
Okay.
And then the car takes off. It just into first gear, bang, gone. And this bag falls in front of me, just in front of my feet. At first, I picked up the bag and I was going to yell, hey, like, "Oi, where are you going? You've dropped your bag." But the car just took off very, very fast and was gone. Actually, this story is in my book. And when I was pitching my book to one publisher, he actually came back to me and asked me if the story was true. Yeah, that one. I don't remember the chapter where it is in. You have to read the whole thing.
It's The Renegade, a memoir of a Soviet cyclist. And I'll put a link to it in the blog post. But yeah, and it has the chapters down below. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
Everyone calls it a book, but it is a book, but it's not finished. I need to tell it to your listeners. So anyway, that bag falls in front of my feet, and I picked it up, and I wanted to start yelling, but the car was gone. So out of curiosity, I opened the bag, and it's full of cash. Like, it's packed with 100 ruble notes.
Wow.
Like full. And I'm with my friend, and he says, "Run." So the bag had a zipper. So I opened the zipper, unzipped the bag, looked inside. It's full of cash. And he says, "Run." So I zip it back, and we start running. Like, we were running for probably, 5 minutes at least.
Okay.
Like, turning right, left, just get the hell out of there. So we ran into this little kind of a garden, full of trees and bushes. And we just literally crashed on the ground and just lay down, hoping that these guys will, even if they come back, they will not find us.
Right.
So we spent a couple of minutes just sitting there, and then I opened the bag just to look again what's inside, and pull out this cash. It's full of cash, 100 ruble bills. It was close to 10,000 rubles. Now, just to give you a perspective, my salary at the time was 200 rubles.
Okay.
And it was pretty high.
Yeah.
So you're talking about, 50 times of monthly income? So what's a monthly income in the United States? Average like 5,000, 4,000?
Yeah, like
so
4,000.
200 grand in that bag.
Sure.
So plus, it's not all. It had probably 100 maybe gram of gold, like melted gold in these little blobs of, like, you can't even describe, like, it's just pieces of gold, right?
Yeah.
So usually what was happening at the time is people were buying gold because gold was very cheap in Soviet Union, but it was quite expensive in the West. So people were buying gold and taking it to Poland and Romania and selling it, buying dollars, going back to Soviet Union, buying gold, going back. There was a business like that. Anyway, they had a lot of gold, like, 50 gram, 100 gram, I don't know. And also it had scales, like very small portable scales, which tells me this was a drug dealer, or maybe he was buying gold. I don't know.
Sure.
It was full of cash. And so we decided with my friend to split it, even though I found it, because he was a very close friend of mine.
Right.
We decided to split it 50-50. And that was, as I said, that was the beginning of the end of my career. So we had all this cash. And if you read my book, you would probably get an idea that I was not, even though, without boasting, I was a talented rider, right? I won the world championship. I was considered like having a big future in cycling.
Right.
But as a person, I was not really committed. I was committed when I needed to. But generally speaking, I was like a bad boy, like what's usually known as a bad boy. So I like to party. I like to break discipline. And I was punished so many times. I was disciplined so many times. And eventually this money didn't do me any good because I went on a very long party streak.
Yeah.
And it would not end, and it ended eventually in me being fired from my team, which ended my career.
Yeah.
Which prompted me to leave the Soviet Union. So I was fired. I went continued to spiral down, was alcohol, drugs. I was trying to literally kill myself because my career had finished. I had nothing to do. I had this money. I was still paid by the government. They forgot to cancel my salary. And then eventually I managed to get out and reboot my life, so to speak. So that's one crazy idea. And as part of this incident with money, I was also almost shot once. Again, because we had so much money with my friend. Once we came back to Kyiv after this race, we continued partying, like it was non-stop. So we went to this bar, and I knew the bar, like not the owner, it was not privately owned, but the guy who ran the bar, I knew him from previous times. Like he was not a friend, but someone I knew very well. And he allowed us, because we were spending so much money, he allowed us to stay after the bar was closed. Like it was closed at 2 o'clock in the morning, something like that. But because we kept buying alcohol and kept drinking, and we were friends, he said, you can stay as long as you like. So at about 4 o'clock, we decided to leave. And as we got outside, this is on the outskirts of Kyiv, like maybe 20 kilometers away from the outskirts of Kyiv. So we were walking to a highway where we were hoping to catch a car, not a taxi, just a car to get us back to the city, to make it to 6 o'clock when the team would wake up. So we had to make it back to 6 o'clock.
My goodness, wow.
Yeah. So as we're walking back, we see this group of people, like 3 guys and a girl being beaten up. So we're walking up and we hear this screaming and yelling, and this guy is just beating this woman. So we approach, and we were drunk, like completely drunk. So we approach these guys and going like, hey, what's going on? Leave this girl alone. And this guy says, you guys keep walking. And he calls us kids. And this is 89, we were 23. I was 23, my friend was 21. So he calls us kids. And he just says, get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
And my friend, he is a tall guy, a tall, lean guy. He's like 6 foot, more, slightly. And we both grew up in this kind of neighborhoods where we would not take this lightly. When someone says, get the hell out of here, we would do the opposite. So this guy says, my friend says to this guy, what if we don't? And he told him something, I don't know. And my friend, he was like standing next to him. He immediately lands a punch into his face. And he's tall, as I said, and he's a strong guy.
Yeah.
So he punches this guy, and the guy falls on the ground. And the fight begins, There are 2 of us and 3 of them.
Yeah.
But it was very short. Like lots of street fights are really short, unlike what you see in the movies, where they're smashing themselves. So we punched them a couple of times. They punched us. But the guy who got on the ground first, when my friend hit him, he fell on the ground. He was still on the ground. And then at some point, he pulls out a gun. And also he pulls out what we call in Russia, korочка. And korочка is ID of a police officer.
Oh.
So he pulls out a gun and also his ID as a police officer. So these guys turned out to be police.
Okay.
In civilian clothes. I mean, they were drunk.
Yeah.
They had a party and they had an argument with this. I don't know who this girl. She actually ran away as soon as we started fighting. She took off.
Okay.
Smart girl.
Yeah.
So she took off, and this guy stands up and he puts a gun into my head, and he says, "Pray." And in Russia, that means they give you 5 seconds to sort it out with God. Pray means you're going to die in a few seconds. So he said,
wow. Okay.
He said, pray. In the meantime, and obviously, I don't even know what to think. I pretty much shocked and think this is it. The end had arrived. But the other guys, his friends, started yelling at him, basically saying, don't do it because it's going to be a mess. You don't want to have this kind of mess on your hands. Like, what are you going to do with that right now?
Right.
So we had a bit of you can read it in the book. It's in the book as well. Had a bit of a exchange of words, and they let us go.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's a couple of crazy stories for you.
Yeah, I have nothing like that. I have nothing. Oh man. Wow. Well, Nikolai, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. And we've had, discussion before this. I've been, reading more of your work. I'll put links to it, including, the Renegade, a memoir of a Soviet cyclist. And I'm so, enthralled by what, the stories, the experience that you've shared. And I remember when I initially contacted you, I thought this would solely be about, being in Kyiv and seeing the buses and, led over the buses and this whole experience. And that was part of it. That was an introduction. And then all of a sudden it was this bigger picture of looking at the access to information and the way that state information was starting to also have this private information that was coming out, these private newspapers, and how you process all this information. I'm like, oh my God, there's this whole other story here that I had no idea about, and just so much more. But I'm a fan of your work, and I love biking, by the way. So we both are bicyclists. I'm a very casual bicyclist. I'm not a.
Never on the bike. I've seen your report on Twitter. 60 miles. I don't do 60 miles at the moment. So you. Yeah.
Well, I do. I go for distance, but I don't go for speed. But we have a lot of country around here, countryside, and actually, I get to bike past. Get this, I get to bike past 1,000-year-old Native American effigy mounds that are shaped like bears and birds. Some of the routes that I take go right past those. Where I live, this is the most dense area in North America for effigy mounds. So it's very regular to go past these ancient, 1,000-year-old plus. Actually, in my city, it dates back. One of the paths between two rivers goes back 10,000 years. So it's pretty fascinating when I'm out. I get to take this in, and we have a lot of sandhill cranes. So it's kind of a novelty in my area because I grew up in the northern part of Wisconsin, and we didn't have sandhill cranes. So there's big sandhill cranes kind of walking around out in the country, there are fields and stuff like that. Obviously cows, deer, eagles, stuff like that. Nikolai, again, thank you so much for being a guest on the Safety Doc podcast, and wishing you the very best, you and your family in Australia, and we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
This has been the Safety Doc Podcast with author, radio show host, and leading safety expert, Dr. David Perrodin. Remember to check back each week for the latest, best, and most bizarre practices in safety preparation and crisis response. You can find Dr. Perrodin on Twitter @SafetyPhD. And remember, the truth will keep you safe.